Can you hear me now?
Okay, we have our expert panelists ready to go. I just want to welcome everybody. Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar on cultivating a culture of change. Today, we will explore the role that culture plays as a critical success factor in digital transformation. My name is Rita Derdulian, and I will be introducing our panelists in one moment. Just a few notes to make before we dive into what will surely be an informative discussion. Please take advantage of the Q&A options. Our panelists will address as many questions as possible today. We will also reserve 10 minutes towards the end of the hour for this as well. We will be sharing the on-demand version of this webinar with you all next week, along with a brief survey. If you have any technical difficulties during the event, please reach out to me at my email here or via the Q&A feature. And now I'd like to introduce our panel of experts. We have Wayne Bouvier, co-founder and CEO of Higher Digital, Colleen Baker, co-founder and chief operating officer of Higher Digital, Kelly Bratter, vice president of CIO services and security for Higher Digital, and today's discussion will be facilitated by Joe Gottlieb, president of Higher Digital. With that, I'd like to have Joe take it away.
Thanks, Rita, and welcome everyone to our webinar on culture. Culture, we believe, is the single most critical success factor in accomplishing strategic change. And so it is a really, really important topic to study, to understand, to apply what you can learn, and to continue to evolve throughout your efforts and your journeys into an increasingly digital world. We launched our culture assessment last October in 2020 at the EDUCAUSE show. And we've already collected some preliminary data from assessment takers that have been identifying the ways in which culture operates in their organizations. And we'll continue to study this topic. But today what we wanted to do was share some of those preliminary findings along with a lot of our views and perspectives that we've developed about culture and how it is so critical to the way that you operate your organizations, the way that you embrace strategic change, the way that you cope with the need for applying data to how you make decisions, and a variety of other topics and factors. And so with that, I'd like to dive in. We've got a set of slides here for you today that'll trigger a discussion. Looking forward to having all of our panelists weigh in on these topics. And we start out with really a discussion of extremes. You know, if you look at culture in relationship to change, you could think about it, at least in terms of these two axes, as having a very interesting tendency to stretch organizations in one direction or another. And organizations will tend to fit somewhere in this 2x2. The axes we're using here is we're looking at quality of change as well as the commitment to change. And if you look first at commitment, right? Seriously, if people are just totally focused on change, in an extreme right side of this diagram, you can tend to see change for the sake of change, and we see some of that. On the opposite extreme, if you see a very low commitment to change, you might even be experiencing an aversion to change, and we see a fair amount of that, probably even more so. In higher ed, where there are a lot of traditions, there's a lot of success, and a lot of times success breeds an attachment to the patterns that produce that success. In many cases, that makes a lot of sense. But as things change in our market, there's a need to build some new muscles in terms of allowing us to make adjustments and to start to change. In the other axis, you've got quality of change. And if you're really good at how you change and where you change and why you change, you can bring some very positive things about in your organization. And so I'd like to invite our panelists here to talk a bit about things that they see in this domain. But for starters, I'll provide one observation. And one is that particularly as the digital world has forced the evolution of institutions to really change and think about how their markets are evolving, how the students' needs are changing, how education is delivered. In some cases, it's been hard for institutions to figure out how to retain their identity. Identities based upon a great history of delivery of education, of in many cases, beautiful campuses and campus experiences that really represent what we all sort of think about when we think about higher education. And as we've expanded into the online world, that has forced institutions to really reimagine themselves. And so it can be a little bit challenging to retain your identity as you embark on these journeys and as you deliver education in these new forms. And so finding that balance becomes very, very important. And sometimes not being able to find the balance can become an obstacle to tackling those changes that might be necessary to participate in a market that is having a lot of growth online. So with that, let me open it up and invite our participants, our panelists, to weigh in on this particular topic. Anyone?
Who wants to go first?
I can say, I think the change for change's sake, the high commitment to change, we see very, very rarely. I see the change aversion more commonly, but your high commitment to change, I've seen institutions create workarounds for their workarounds, right? And so that there's a high degree of commitment to customize for the end unit businesses. And so they create a workaround to, instead of a standardized approach, they look at customizing. And then when that fails, or they create another workaround, which is yet another customization, right? And the end result ends up happening that you have a high level of customization and therefore kind of a technical debt that you have to maintain this customization. In really, what problem were you originally trying to solve, right? It kind of gets lost when you go down that rabbit hole. And so going back and looking at the original problem, and also looking at perhaps business process options instead of solving the issue with technology and customized workarounds. That would be my reflection on that.
I would just add to that, Joe, and I think you did a great job kind of teeing this up. At a very high level view, the higher education industry, globally, really, when it really comes down to it, especially pre-COVID, the drive and the need to change was debatable, right? I mean, one good thing about higher education institutions, right, is that there's a lot of debate. That's kind of part of the whole process of learning. And so, the need to go from the sage on the stage, right, to the guide on the side is really one of the major parts that's kind of driving a lot of this change. And then, COVID has accelerated and has certainly opened the eyes of a lot of administrators when it comes to the need to change. And so as a culture, there just really hasn't been an overwhelming driving force. It's kind of been, kind of a slow evolving. I mean, there's folks like us that have been advocating the necessary need to change for quite a long time, both in how effective teaching is when you're the sage on the stage versus guide on the side. I mean, the reason the guide on the side is coming about is not only through the technology, but it's much more, it produces better outcomes. And there's more and more research that's coming out about this. And so I think at a very high level, institutions have been on the left-hand side in terms of their commitment to change. But I think post-COVID, one of the things that we're going to see is a much stronger commitment to changing and really understanding the benefits of leveraging technology and embracing digital transformation to accomplish and improve the outcomes that they're so desperately seeking for decades.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Wayne. And I think what we've seen historically in higher ed, slow commitment to change. Basically, we'll get around to it. There are other things we need to spend our money on, especially when it comes to all the things of customizations and technical debt that Kelly was speaking to. And so they have been slow to change. But when COVID hit, it forced them to potentially have to deliver how we do teaching and learning differently, and how we do student outcomes differently, and how we do content differently, and all of those things came into question and came into question very quickly, as well as all of the other things for security and network and infrastructure and everything else hit. And so some of those things that they've delayed on and said they would do later hit, right? And so Kelly and I see this all the time, and Wayne, I know you do too, in our engagements when we're working with our clients. We see this panic, right? Now they have this panic, or we've been seeing this through this past year. And so we started questioning why this panic, right? And so Joe, to back to your original question, which was around brand, which was around, what are we seeing, and some of the reluctance, I think, to change that we've seen, especially in some of our private institutions, really around that question of how much change do we want to do? And if we do too much change, are we changing our culture? Are we changing who we are? Are we changing our brand? Institutions are very proud of their brand, and they should be. And they've spent a lot of time building that brand up. And so they have to be very, have some precision and be particular around what they spend their money on and how much change to the point their brand changes. And I think COVID, especially if you're a campus-based institution that really didn't have much of an online presence, did that online presence enhance your brand? Were they comfortable with that or not? Right. And so those are the things that we try to help and coach them think through, that it's okay. And that we got to address it, whether we want to or not.
I think we may want to come back to some of these modalities on this 2x2, right? Because I think what we'll find is the institutions that get into a good rhythm of figuring out how to evolve, how to have the right kind of changes that are sustainable and fitting with both strategy and deliverability, we're going to see disruption, right? Because the market is ripe for disruption. It's continuing to expand, but it's expanding in new ways. And so we'll come back to this, but what I want to keep pressing on here, because the next slide, we talk about business and technology orientation. And this, to me, I know this is one of our favorite topics, because what lies at the core of most challenges in the increasingly digital world is, what role is technology playing in an organization, in your culture, in your leadership and management structure? And as I like to joke, is IT, at the table, which is ideal in our opinion, or are they on the table berating the table to listen, or under the table not even heard, right? And sort of, for any institution, asking that hard question, I think, is quite useful. But ultimately, you can't escape the use of technology. If you do, you're going to be sort of laid at the side of the market over time. But how you bring this orientation together, this alignment, is really, really super critical. And I know this is what we encounter in every engagement. I know. Yeah. So any points on this one?
I'll start. This particular slide I love is simple, but it conveys a very powerful message around change. We have been, for quite a long time advocating the organizational structure on the right, which essentially puts in places digital leadership, information IT leadership in the seat that is both strategic as well as execution oriented, where technology tends to be just an enabler. It's not the end all be all. And so, the diagram that you have on the left is a traditional diagram. And what's interesting is when you dive into higher education, the management isn't just one box. It's a whole bunch of boxes silos on top of IT. And each one of those boxes actually has budget authority, decision-making. And so you have an IT organization that traditionally, you go back 40 years, has been, is a service organization. You do what I tell you because I own the budget, and don't debate, right? And so the one on the right is all about, wait a minute, you are now my equal, and there's more consideration and things that we need to talk about. I need to bring you in on my rationale about why this particular CRM solution is way better than this other solution. There's a variety of other things. And so the answer for institutions going forward must be what's on the right. What's on the left is very antiquated.
There's a subtlety in here, though, that I want to pick up on, and that is that I think what might happen first, before, when people move from the orientation of the structure on the left towards the structure on the right, they might think of it as IT becomes their equal at the table. But ultimately, where it needs to go, there's a representative facilitating the importance of technology in the conversation. And that's what someone at the table can represent. But everyone needs to be thinking at the level of business process enabled by technology for it to work, right? And so you will rely upon your expertise that you might need, where you might need help stretching your ability to think in this way. But ultimately, business process by its nature is a technology supported process. And so as we all get better about thinking about that as leaders and as managers of higher ed institutions, now technology is really working for us. And that's the way it should be. That now we've really enabled that technology layer at the very bottom to really deliver, because we have a good healthy structure, an active collaborative structure whereby we're thinking about this as first nature, not even second nature.
Yeah, technology is enabler and, and not a cost center, right? It's not viewed as just a black hole that you pour into money, but as a tool to hold up the mission of the institution and their core functions and as an enabler.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to mention, is that historically, or I mean, across the board, especially on institutions, IT is an expense. It's seen as it's an expense. Rarely do we have institutions that where their IT or their technology is driving revenue for that institution. And so this is part of that culture change, right? We have to coach our executive leaders to understand the value, and that it's much more than keep the lights on, right? And so, it's the situations that we run into where it's, we're speaking with, a dean from one school, and they went ahead and purchased technology that already existed somewhere else. And so now they have two versions of that. And so when business and leaders on the business side make decisions without understanding downstream impact or understanding what's available today or how they can leverage things they don't need to customize, it adds to that overall debt that Kelly was talking about before. And it makes it much more difficult to really get the outcomes that they're looking for. And so having that person on the leadership team to advise early on is really what we want to see.
Joe, if I could just jump in here, I think Colleen said something that was pretty interesting, and I want to bring this back to the broader culture of institutions. And Colleen, you said the word expense in terms of IT spend versus, right, strategic, right, a strategic mindset. I'm actually, going to challenge the industry that I don't even think that, that the expense mindset is, there's a lot of lip service around expense, but when you really dive into it, there's really little discipline. What we are uncovering is there's a lot of little discipline at a centralized, no one's really empowered. Sometimes the CIO is, but for the most part, if a budget authority owner, a VP, dean wants a particular technology, they'll get it. With little, with disregard essentially to the expense, lots of institutions have multiple licenses of different vendors doing the same thing. 50,000 institutions, FTE institution had 9 portals licensed. They were using one, but they were still actively paying for 9 portals. That's just one of many examples.
Yeah, look, I think this is a whole nother topic that I would love to get into. I want to move on from here, but this whole notion of expense versus tie into revenue, I think there's success modalities across the board there that we should examine and talk about. But Colleen, your last point really raises the importance of strategic alignment. Right? At the end of the day, and frankly, I think this is the biggest challenge, at least in terms of the way we think about change and what ought to drive change. And then are we aligned in executing change? To me, this becomes the fulcrum or the hinge point for success. And boy, oh boy, is this where culture has such a great influence. Because if we have poor linkage, which most organizations, and I've been studying this all throughout my career, most organizations in all verticals have poor linkage between strategy and execution. And if you have poor linkage, culture is going to wind up filling in the gaps that are created, or the sort of the behavioral dysfunction that are going to come out of that poor linkage. So we say good strategic alignment tends to nourish culture, whereas poor strategic alignments will strain the culture. But even wrapping all of that, your current culture is going to affect this linkage, right? And how it's having an impact on your organization. So here's some preliminary data pulled from our assessment, and we chose to present these in sort of decreasing order of optimism. So at the very top here, right, one of the questions in the survey asks, work priorities are clearly communicated, allowing me to focus on the tasks that are most important to the organization. Okay, that scored 5 out of 10. So pretty mediocre-ish, not super high, but not super low, right? But it gets a little challenging from there. And we weren't shocked to see that in these questions that pertain to strategic alignment, right, it gets a little bit challenging in a hurry. So the next one, our leadership team is accountable for the changes it makes, consistency, collecting feedback, and then following through. Also a mediocre score, but higher than these other two, these last two, really assessing the business process implications of, in this case, a technology change, not scoring well at all, and even worse, the tracking of success criteria to ensure our improved alignment as we work to execute our goals. And so I don't think any of us were surprised by these results, but they reinforce some really important things that we tend to talk to our customers about, right? How they can get better at these things, because there's so much potential that can be unlocked with improving on these points right here. And I know we've seen some examples of that, as well as some examples of some real struggles in this area. Thoughts?
Should I go first?
Sure, please.
So what we coach on this, literally every engagement that we have, and it is a challenge, and it does impact culture, because often we're kind of, we come up with these recommendations and ideas on what they should invest their money on and how they should do it. And then it's really slow to kick off, or it kicks off and it's really slow to catch on. And so that's why, right? And so we talk about the concept between bidirectional communication, right? How well as an organization are we able to communicate as leaders exactly what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, what are the outcomes we're looking for, what do we call success, how are we going to measure it, all of those things that we need to do. And often we hear from leadership from a KPI perspective, I want increased enrollments, I want increased renewals. Well, that's great, but we need to break those down a little bit in order. What does that really mean when we go to execute, when we actually go to work on that? And this is not just a technology thing. This is across the institution. Anybody working on anything really should be aligned to those overall KPIs. And so what we see is we just don't do a great job at that communicating down, but then communicating back, because we can also say how often do we make changes on the technology side, didn't tell anyone, and it interrupted, an enrollment period, or interrupted something very important on the institution side. So what we focus on is really looking at that. How well are we doing that communication and alignment?
And part of that interplay, right? I love the sort of the image of that, right? This two-way communication is so critical, but I know we also advocate the iteration between those two, because problem solving across this barrier of strategic change, business process, which is running the business, and then technology enablement, you've got to iterate, right? You've got to problem solve across that to, how we get better, how we get more enrollments is going to be a dialogue about, well, what business programs are we going to invest in? Are we going to do this different form of recruiting? Do we need a better database? Do we need to reduce our cycle time for reviewing the results of our campaigns, to bring in new layers in our pipeline for prospective students? Like all that is pre any discussion of technology. But then when you make this a conversation, you're now talking about, okay, well, here's our current architecture. Here's how quickly I could deliver this for this enrollment recruiting season. But I could make it better next time around now that you've given me a bit of notice, right? I'm gonna make the bigger change next time, but this time I can make this change. And so let's make this work and let's iterate. How can we make that adequate, right? So that's just one example, right, of this iterative problem solving. And this right here, that is the muscle tissue that does not exist because leaders and managers are not used to having this kind of conversation, and technologists on average aren't either. Now, frankly, technologists' survival has been dependent upon them swimming upstream as best they can to participate in this and to figure that out and to anticipate the need. But even that's a struggle in many cultures.
Yeah, and I also think you can really draw parallels under the good strategic alignment nourishes culture and poor strategic alignment strains culture, in that, I think all of us have experienced, you're working on teams and you find out that you were working on the wrong thing, or it wasn't right. It wasn't quite what you wanted to. And everybody gets frustrated because they wanted to be working on the right things, and they don't want to think that their work has gone to waste, right? That they've done it for naught. And in reverse, right? Everybody loves the fact that, they may have been mentioned that technology enabled the increase in enrollment by XYZ, right? And that's something that happens, that gets acknowledged when there's good strategic alignment and employees feel good about contributing to the mission of the institution, and that what the work that they did mattered. And so it's just makes a lot of sense.
And I think the leadership starts to develop memory about how that problem solving produced an outcome. And that muscle tissue starts to attach to those bones as well, right? So now leadership is saying, I've got an engine here that I can do some damage with, right? I like the way this starts to feel. Now, so we've talked about this hinge point, strategy and change, business and technology. We've talked about what's good, but there's something that tends to hold us back, and we've already mentioned it a couple of times. So Rita, if you would advance to the next slide, it's technical debt. Wayne, let's talk about technical debt, because it's a recurring theme, and the best organizations have figured out how to wrestle this beast.
Yeah, that's right. And Kelly mentioned it right, kind of right at the beginning. But technical debt tends to end up being a direct result of the misalignment between institutional strategy and digital strategy. In many cases, digital reaction implementation, right? And so, this is a survey. This slide is a survey from McKinsey done recently in mid 2020. And this is across all industries. And so there's some interesting things here that really kind of stand out in terms of overall spend. But for those, for the attendees that may not be familiar with exactly what technical debt is, it's a relatively new concept for higher education, but it's something that has been widely known in a variety of other industries. But simply put, technical debt is like a credit card. And anything technical, right? It could be your ERP system, your CRM. There's technical debt associated with that. That is divvied up between principal and interest. And so the principal basically is, what do you need to do to kind of modernize your entire technology stack? And the interest is really about the complexity. And in particular, complexity get amplified around custom. So bringing this back to the culture, if you have a culture where the change in the people process, whether it's the registrar process, whether it is the graduation process, you pick it. It's easier, and I'm using air quotes, right? Easier to actually throw bodies at something uh, and increase the manual, right? And versus actually leveraging the software for out of the box capabilities. And through my journey in higher education and a lot of our work that we're doing to date, I'm estimating that at least 90% plus of higher education institutions have a significant level of technical debt. And it's underappreciated because this technical debt ends up being a direct result of these customizations. Hey, my organization is so, we need, our process is so, change the software. That was also very easy, right? In the last 20 years, maybe a little bit longer, where there was, this advent of kind of on-premise software, data centers, right? Now moving to the cloud software is, very limiting in many ways. And so, so I think in terms of the culture, some of the things in advice for those attendees that this is kind of near and dear to your heart, unifying, just from what we talked about in the last slide, unifying your institutional strategy with your digital strategy is one thing that you can do. Aligning and centralizing your IT funding and strategy, i.e. removing budget authority from all those silos and unifying it under a new role, like a chief digital officer. Treat software customization requests as a major funding request. Any customization should be treated as so serious that it warrants the CFO getting involved to really understand what are truly the financial implications, because the financial implications are significant. When you really, and there's some different formulas that are out there to calculate technical debt, but it can end up being a pretty significant, direct hard cost associated with that. And then the last thing I would highlight in terms of some of the considerations around the technical debt is, you got to improve your change management process. It's ultimately easier to change the human process than it is the software. And it's less expensive, it's easier, so on and so forth. But institutions like we talked about are really not, they're good at a lot of things, but change and modernizing the human processes and so on is something that they're going to have to get better at. Institutions must get better at.
Yeah, when I look at this, you mentioned customization as a very evil thing. It is a very evil thing. It is very tempting, and we're trained to do it. And you said this, Wayne. We're trained to do it from the era of on-premise software implementation that welcomed, if not tempted, without a lot of guardrails, customization. With SaaS, the opportunity, and this doesn't say it's easy, the opportunity is to realize I'm going to pick a vendor based upon their understanding of how my business processes work and their ability to automate them, and to allow me configurability within a set of guardrails that they can handle in their architecture. Then the rest is up to me as an institution. I'm going to outperform my peers using that software with my own ability to drive strategy and the way I configure that software, the way I evolve process, the way I communicate, the way I hire talent, the way I train and evolve my people. That's how we compete atop SaaS. It's so different than what we were trained to do with software, which was go make this our version of software that reflects the way we do business. And what we did was we got into this pattern of having to be software developers or needing our vendor and or our partners to help us get there. And that just didn't work very well. So anyway,
there's a perfect example on this, and you can kind of move to the next slide if you want. But there's give a concrete example for the attendees. There's a very big institution that we were involved with in the last 10 years that ultimately their technical debt of just their one SIS system was valued at $20 million. And this happened literally after a upgrade from and they stayed. It wasn't a replacement; it was an upgrade. The upgrade was overly manual. It took 3 years because of 100 customization. That ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, that's still a fair amount in my opinion. But overall, I've seen way worse. And here's where this becomes a real problem in the business of higher education. Well, because they spent 3 million, 3 years to upgrade the system, and it was so calcified because of these customizations, they were unable to offer and deploy a mobile app. So when you think about recruiting students and getting enrollment from the mobile device, they couldn't do it. So they were looking at not only, basically $20 million of fixing this whole system. And most of these customizations were all about the manual processes. So it had a very direct impact on the future revenue opportunities. And certainly, being viewed as a modern online institution and not having a mobile app was a real challenge.
Wow. Well, that's a good segue, Wayne. We've talked about getting that alignment right. We've talked about technical debt as something that tends to hold us back. Let's talk about change management. Colleen, I know you're our resident expert on this. I'd love you to take us through some of the early data on change management and some of your sort of reflections on the way this process can be handled when it's best in class.
Yeah, I think when we start looking at why change doesn't succeed, why digital transformation doesn't happen, why does it stop, why is it not successful? When we see that, there's multitude of reasons, but one of them, this slide is speaking to in particular, there's the fear out there that if we change, we can't go back, right? So if we implement a change, this is it. If we try something new, that's it. We can't change it. I'm going to be stuck doing this new thing, even if it doesn't work. And I might as well just stay with the old thing, because the old thing, at least I knew it. And I had all these nice workarounds and customizations in place. And now you made me do this new thing, and this new thing isn't working either. And now what? Right. And so there's this whole kind of fear of, if I adopt something new and that doesn't work, then what? Might as well just stay with what we have. And so this is really speaking to, are we able to make a change, look at that change, and then say, and do a retrospective of sorts, which is kind of saying, you know what, is this working? And if it's not working, how do we improve it? And so really this question is about how well do we do that? Are we looking at these processes and are we able to make the change, and are we communicating? Do we feel comfortable knowing that if I take on something new and a new change, that there's opportunity to do a retrospective and say, hey, this isn't working the way we intended. Let's go ahead and change again, right? We can continually improve, and that's the basis of continual improvement. So that's really what we want to implement in our processes. This is really talking to, there's a couple things here. Some of the reasons that you see this happen, folks might say, you know what, we start the change and then leadership doesn't want to do it anymore. Leadership changes their mind. New management comes in and tells us to stop, start, stop, start. So there's this concept of, are we able to follow through with what we said we were going to do in the first place? We have this KPI, we have this goal. Are we actually following through, or do we start, stop, start, stop? So that's one of the reasons. Truth, right? And so there's a fear that, well, if I told the truth about this and maybe I exposed, it takes me longer than someone else, or maybe there's something going on, I'll get caught. That's not good. I'd rather not even go there or talk about it. And then also business drivers, are we really looking at these things in depth enough to know, will this solution actually solve the problem, right? And so that will cause a start, stop as well, right? Going down a path, didn't really do the right analysis, purchase technology or went down a new process or customization, doesn't really solve for it. Guess what, guys? We've got to do it all over again, right? Because it may have introduced more issues. So these are just the kinds of things that people fear, and understandably, right? But that doesn't mean we don't change, right? That doesn't mean these are understood, and we got to go in there with a plan and know it. But we have to see these things head on and head first, and come up with a plan and approach to deal with that up front.
Yeah, so let's take a look at those in-flight change points of guidance that we have on the next slide. I know, Colleen, these are things that you work with customers on. Rita, if you could advance to the next slide. Steps to manage in-flight change.
We're here. I think we're there.
Okay, great.
Yep. So this is, so this was one of the things. So what do we do about it, right? So some of it is folks just don't know how to change. So you think about technical debt, and usually when we talk about technical debt, rarely do we hear, no, we don't have technical debt. Everyone's going to admit that they have it, right? Everyone knows that, you know, a lot of folks are, after they understand what it is, folks will agree, yeah, this is a problem and we should look at it, but they don't know what to do about it. And often from a culture perspective, we need to help them, right? We need to teach them. They're not just going to figure it out on their own. And so we need to come up with a plan. But what they'll say is, great, we'll do this, but we don't want to interrupt any of the projects we have in flight. We don't want to interrupt anything that we're currently working on. We don't want to interrupt the student experience. We don't want to interrupt faculty and staff. And so how do we implement something without the interruption? Because again, that's another fear. That's another reason from a culture perspective that we see why digital transformation doesn't work, because they don't know how to manage in-flight change. And so these are just a couple of steps of the important one of these steps. First, understand what you're changing and why, but you really need a transition plan, right? We're really talking about these changes don't happen in a vacuum. They're not happening in a silo, and they shouldn't, right? So we encourage that alignment. We encourage alignment across the organization, but also how do we get from point A to point B? And it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, change doesn't happen overnight. And so it's okay to say, I'm going to need 4 months to get there, right? And you come up with a plan on how you're going to get there. And then you do your retrospectives throughout to make sure that that plan is approaching and addressing those problems that you identified in the first place.
So one of the things that I think is important to reinforce here is that we get back to that role of business and technology and that alignment, right? So it's not just where I love the notion of we're fearful of interrupting the business. When this is going right, when this is going well, the business is more anxious to change than the technology itself, right? And it's the business saying, we got to have this. So how together are we going to pull this off? And so therefore they're fitting into their process. Let's say it's an enrollment season or a rolling up the book season or whatever it is, whatever business cycle we're going through. Those business owners that are driving the need to change are actually saying, okay, I'm going to make room for this because I want a better automation platform ASAP. And I'm going to, we're going to fit it in. And so that becomes I think a key way that the culture starts to stitch this in. And we often, I catch myself oftentimes when I'm working with customers speaking in this tone of voice, which is sort of kind of the new medicine to take. Like if we can, like if we could apply this new thing. But oftentimes when you then turn it around and think, okay, now immerse yourself in that situation, it feels quite different. It's now a dialogue. It's now, all right, we're approaching this from a completely different mentality. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. And I want to get into data-driven cultures, because what will help us get into that new modality, that new interaction, hopefully, are the data that can tell us things are changing, the data that can give us the truth around whether we're having an impact or where we need to have more impact, right? And so let's talk about data-driven cultures. And I got to start out by saying perhaps the most elusive but talked about practice in business. It's not limited to higher ed, let me tell you, right? Is being data driven, really being smart about measuring stuff and measuring more stuff over time and committing to that cycle and getting better at it. It's hard, right? Kelly, I know you've got a lot of experience in this domain. Take us through some of these points, please.
So I think it was really telling that when we looked at the data, the accumulated aggregated data from our respondents, that tracking success criteria on strategic alignment to meet institution goals was the lowest average score out of across all our questions, right? And so we give a lot of lip service to being a data-driven institution, but we don't practice it. We talk about it. And so the other thing I think that we also tend to do in higher education is that we have all sorts of different KPIs that we measure across different institutions and in its enrollment. And it's all these high level. And if you go to any college website and look about the about section, there's always fast facts about the institution. And I think less is more here. That when you are trying to achieve, be thoughtful about what you're wanting to measure, because measuring will drive change. In the fact that you're looking at it, examining it, watching that measurement, it will drive change. So be very deliberate in selection, and also not trying to boil the ocean. You're going to lose the impact. People aren't going to know what to focus on. So be thoughtful and build it into the fabric of your culture, right? If you're going to create a data-driven culture, Colleen started to talk about measuring the right thing, right? And maybe you put in a solution and you analyzed it and it's not having the expected results. And so you there's an amazing amount of data out there, collect the data and look at it for the problem that you're trying to solve and focus on that. I was working with a customer that had an issue with the student experience in their UX, and we found that in this particular experience, 53% of the students that tried this experience never navigated to the end, right? That is data that really speaks to the issue. And so I would encourage, our customers and our listeners to focus on the data that's going to tell them the story and be very focused, right? I think that we have created all this data and are measuring it, and most of our resources are in our human capacity hasn't built the skill set to exercise and understand that data and have good practices around it. So as long, as you build the technology to collect all this data, being deliberate about developing skill sets around that is very, very important. And then from a basic standpoint, every day start to adopt those practices that measure and use it, right? Ask questions around, well, how do you know that, right? Is there evidence in data that made you come to that conclusion? From a small project like improving the help desk to the improving enrollment, exercising that muscle and analyzing the correct thing and being focused instead of trying to boil the ocean. Those would be my high level remarks on that.
We also observe, and we know from the literature and things like Myers-Briggs, that some people are data oriented and some people are more intuition oriented. And so being aware of what your team is composed of in terms of those personality types can be very important. Figuring out how to let that dialogue occur between folks that are more comfortable with intuition and folks that are more comfortable with data, but then finding the best of both worlds, right? Like, how can we together look at this from multiple angles, but yet be decisive and be iterative? And as Colleen was saying, take a shot at something, but do it in an increment that allows us to walk back or extend based upon what we see and what the data tell us, right? And what our intuition are telling us. And guess what? Intuition gets fueled by data, whether people that are intuition bigots know it or not, right? Our intuition is also picking up on this data. And so I think that's, frankly, there's a bit of a nuance in there, but that can be part of this practice, which can be elusive, but so powerful as you get better at it. It brings us to this, the last slide we have with some data points, and then I want to save some time for questions, and that's on learning organizations. And Kelly, I know this is an area, so we're going to keep the mic at your spot right now. Take us through this data that we see so far on things related to the evolution on this learning organization journey.
Yeah, and so I think you heard Colleen also refer to this as well, right? She talked about retrospect, she talked about iterative, right? And the thought behind in learning organizations and how they influence culture is that, you know, by becoming a better learning organization, you're going to become skilled at creating, acquiring, transferring knowledge, and then taking that knowledge and modifying your behavior about it, right? And that's going to reflect your new knowledge. And I found the data really compelling here is that those respondents understood that they needed to continue to learn and reskill as throughout their career, right? Throughout their path. It really, and again, one of the highest scores, average scores in our data. Yet when you start to dig down, right, we didn't see as much support for that organizationally, right? Is sufficient time given to learn and master new skill sets? Starting to get kind of low, and is innovation and experimentation provided for, right, to move to the future? Can you be adaptable and flexible and innovative? Really another lower average score. So how do you build that skill on a daily basis and build that learning culture? Right. And Colleen, I think, really hit on it, which is the retrospective, asking you the questions, how can I do better? Versus taking a long time to do it. Institutions are very familiar with doing SWOT analysis and strengths and weaknesses and spread that over a period of time. But how can you create a culture that's a safe environment, right? That's not caught up into the blame game, right? And how do you start, right? You start with doing this in small, at small intervals, creating a safe environment, start with anonymous feedback and grow into a culture where honest feedback and kind of self-examination is appreciated and embraced among your teams, right? And so that's where I think that you can have a big impact and impact the culture about learning. And that translates to being better at change, right? Learning from and being less afraid of it because you've exercised and grown that muscle and that skill set to learn.
Yeah.
Hey, Joe, what stands out to me on this particular slide is, institutions are great at teaching, right? So the fact that they're retraining their staff for new skills, not surprised, right? That's good, right? Where they're terrible and where they fall down across the board is in a group cultural setting. And when you think about, for those of us that know agile practices, one of the key tenets around agile is you break up the work product, right? And then ultimately, in this case, right, you launch it, whether it's internal software or external software, and you get feedback and you learn as a group. And then you modify as a group. And so there's a real disconnect, I think, here. What this really comes out is, institutions, again, are very comfortable teaching. They're very comfortable at, hey, go get more training. Great. You need more development skills. No problem. But what they're not good at is being a learning organization.
Yeah.
I think too, just to finish this part up, I think we often also see that leaders have a perception that if we spend time on innovation or something new, we're going to fall behind on our initiatives. And so there's this perception that, nope, you need to focus on just this stuff, nothing new, No new things, no training each other. There's no time for that. Just focus on what's in front of you. And really, they're doing a disservice, right? Because you're not going to ever improve if you don't spend the time on it, right? So it is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I want to leave time for questions and still keep this within a good time frame. So I think that's a good place to rest the prepared remarks. We have a few questions that have made their way to us from the audience, and I'd like to start with this one. We have a great friction between administration and faculty, and that has gotten in the way of our ability to change. And so, any guidance you can provide on how to drive leadership through that would be appreciated. So that's an item that's come up. Who would like to tackle that one?
I'll jump into this. This one's near and dear to my heart. Published a paper, article 2 years plus now. I have a very empathetic and sympathetic view of faculty. Yes, they tend to be, as a group, from a cultural point of view, really resistant on change and so on. But that's a big, broad brush. And when you look at it through the lens of technology and the impact that technology has had on faculty, I would argue, and this is coming from somebody that used to work for Blackboard, and I actually, in 1998 is really kind of where the promises of technology solving faculty's lives went to die, right? Like that's the beginning of the end, essentially, right? Technology, hey, just have this LMS, and it's going to make your job easier working with the students. It has tripled the workload for faculty. And then you start layering in all the different tools and technologies and companies and all this kind of stuff. And then on top of that, you have software companies and IT organizations inside higher ed. I'm going to hold both of them accountable that they have not properly prioritized the experience of the faculty. OPMs, a perfect example. Lots of institutions go to OPMs. Well, what's one of the big impacts of OPMs on faculty? Well, faculty have to log into multiple LMS systems to teach the same class, right? One may be on within their institution, one may be done as part of distance learning through an OPM, an online program management company. So these are all just examples of that. And so the answer really is let's start to engage with faculty and start solving their problems technically in a much more strategic way. So this is kind of one of the cherry on top of this whole session around culture is, instead of yelling and complaining about faculty, engage with them and solve their problems in a way that frees them up to do the job they actually were trained to do, which is engage and teach with students for the most part.
Good answer. Thank you. So I want to get one more question here before we close, and this comes from a community college, and the question is basically how a lot of these notions feel like they make great sense for people with lots of resources. How do I make progress with very limited resources? And I'll just start by saying a lot of what we talked about is about leadership and management, right? And not about budget, but it's about the way that you're operating as a team. And to me, that can be done for free-ish, right? Now you got to recruit, you got to build a team, and sometimes you have to choose one person over another, and sometimes budget and resources and what you can attract based upon those resources has an impact there. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of this is leadership and management, and not throwing money around. What do you guys think?
I think this is also about how do we do more with less, right? So if we're efficient, this all leads to efficiencies, right? If we're communicating bidirectionally, if we understand what we're working on and why, if we're doing retrospectives, if we're iterating and slowly improving and getting feedback, we're working on the right things. All of that leads to efficiencies for a team. And so if they're more efficient, ideally we can do more, right? With the same group. And so we see this all the time where we just work with very small IT shops, right? They just don't have a lot of folks, and they're supplemented by, the SMEs on the business side, which is great. And we create these great teams that support each other, and we align and get efficiencies out of that, right? So you might not have a lot, but that doesn't mean you can't do a lot. You just got to get more efficient.
Right. And to build on what Colleen said, it's about structure and structured communications, right? In providing the teams a way to communicate well and be effective and efficient. And that doesn't take a lot of money.
Right on. Well, Wayne, Colleen, and Kelly, thank you so much for our joining today as our panel of experts. And thank you to our audience for joining us on this discussion about culture and where it can go for you. We invite you to take our culture assessment if you haven't already taken it. And we'd love to continue the dialogue with you. So send us an email at info@hire.digital. We look forward to working with you to help you advance your institution in this increasingly digital world. And with that, let us bring this to a close. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll look forward to hosting you again at another webinar soon.